What you're about to hear should not be in this video. In the forgotten hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains swallow sound and the fog erases memory, there existed a woman whose name was spoken only in whispers, and even then, only when the wind was loud enough to cover the voices. She was not a criminal in any official record. She was not a fugitive. She was not hunted. And yet, in the spring of 1923, she committed an act so disturbing, so calculated, and so terrifying that the entire county fell into a silence that lasted for decades. A sheriff disappeared. A grave was dug, and not a single person in 300 square miles dared to speak. The documents that survive are fragmented, hidden in county archives that were never meant to be opened. The testimonies that exist were recorded in secret, passed down through generations who feared that even mentioning her name would bring misfortune. What you are about to hear is not legend. It is not folklore. It is a reconstruction of events based on suppressed court transcripts, handwritten letters from terrified witnesses, and the personal diary of the only man who tried to investigate and lived to regret it. By the end of this story, you will understand why this woman was never arrested, why the sheriff's body was never recovered, and why an entire community chose to bury the truth alongside him. You will learn 3 things that history tried to erase. The method she used, the reason no one intervened, and the fate of those who eventually broke the silence. Most people would not endure what comes next. But if you stay until the final chapter, you will understand why this story was buried for nearly a century, and why some believe it should have stayed that way. The county of Harlan, in 1923, was not a place where the law meant what it was supposed to mean. It was a place where power was negotiated in back rooms, where debts were settled with silence, and where the mountains themselves seemed to conspire against anyone who tried to leave. The roads were mud and gravel, the towns were clusters of wooden shacks clinging to hillsides, and the people who lived there had learned long ago that survival was not about justice. It was about knowing when to speak and when to disappear. The economy ran on coal, and coal ran on desperation. Men went into the mines before dawn and came out after dark, if they came out at all. Women raised children in houses with no floors, no running water, and no hope of anything better. The company owned the store, the doctor, the preacher, and the sheriff. And the sheriff in Harlan County in 1923 was a man named Elmore Combs. Elmore was not a violent man by reputation. He was something worse. He was a man who had learned how to make people afraid without ever raising his voice. He had been appointed by the coal company, not elected by the people, and everyone in the county understood what that meant. His job was not to enforce the law. His job was to enforce order, and order in Harlan County meant making sure that no one caused trouble for the men who owned the mines. Elmore had a way of showing up at homes in the middle of the night. He never arrested anyone. He never filed charges. He simply appeared, asked a few questions, and left behind a silence that lasted for weeks. People who owed money to the company store found their fences broken. Families who complained about working conditions found their children excluded from the schoolhouse. And anyone who tried to organize the miners found themselves visited by Elmore and his 2 deputies, who never carried guns, but always carried rope. No one knew exactly what the rope was for. No one wanted to find out. The woman, who would later be known only as the Hollow Witch, lived 7 miles outside of the nearest town, in a cabin that had been built by her grandfather before the Civil War. Her name was Alma Skaggs, and she was 41 years old. She had buried 2 husbands, both of them miners, both of them taken by the mountain in different ways. The first had died in a collapse. The second had died of the coughing sickness that came from breathing coal dust for 15 years. She had no children, she had no family left, and she had no intention of leaving the land that her grandfather had cleared with his own hands. Alma was not a witch. She was not a healer, not a conjurer, not a woman of any particular spiritual reputation. What she was, and what the county would later learn to fear, was something far more dangerous. She was a woman who had stopped being afraid. The trouble began in February, when the coal company sent surveyors to the ridge above Alma's property. The company had purchased mineral rights to most of the county decades earlier, but Alma's grandfather had never signed the deed. The land belonged to her, and the coal beneath it belonged to her as well. The company wanted that coal. And when the company wanted something in Harlan County, the sheriff made sure they got it. Elmore Combs arrived at Alma's cabin on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was breaking over the ridge. He came alone, which was unusual. He stood at the edge of her property and called out her name, and when she appeared in the doorway, he removed his hat and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had never been refused. He told her that the company was prepared to offer her a fair price for her land. He told her that the surveyors would begin work the following week. He told her that it would be in her best interest to accept the offer and relocate to one of the company towns in the valley. He told her all of this as if he were doing her a favor, as if he were offering her a gift that she did not deserve. Alma listened without speaking. When he finished, she asked him a single question. She asked him what would happen if she refused. Elmore's smile did not fade. He told her that refusal was not an option. He told her that the company had lawyers, and the lawyers had papers, and the papers said that her grandfather's deed was incomplete. He told her that if she did not leave voluntarily, she would be removed. And then he put his hat back on and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway with the morning fog curling around her feet. That night, Alma did something she had not done in years. She went to the root cellar beneath her cabin, moved aside the jars of preserved vegetables, and uncovered a wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother. Inside the box were tools, not weapons, not poisons, tools. And she began to plan. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you are not, consider doing so now. The story you are hearing is one of 5 that will be released this month, and each one reveals a piece of American history that was deliberately erased. What comes next is darker than what you have already heard, and you will want to be here when the truth finally surfaces. The surveyors arrived on the following Monday, just as Elmore had promised. There were 3 of them, young men from the company's office in Lexington, dressed in clean clothes that had never seen a day of real work. They carried measuring equipment, rolled maps, and a sense of confidence that came from believing that the law was always on their side. They set up their instruments on the ridge above Alma's cabin and began marking trees with white paint, indicating where the access road would be cut. Alma watched them from her porch. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She simply watched, and the men felt her eyes on them like a weight they could not explain. By noon, one of the surveyors had developed a fever. By evening, all 3 of them had packed their equipment and returned to town, claiming that the terrain was too unstable to continue. The company sent a second team the following week. This time, 4 men arrived, accompanied by one of Elmore's deputies. They were more aggressive, more determined, and more certain that whatever had frightened the first team was nothing more than superstition. They set up camp on the ridge and began their work at dawn. By the second day, 2 of the men had fallen ill with symptoms that the company doctor could not explain. By the third day, the deputy had resigned his position and left the county entirely, refusing to say what he had seen. The company did not send a third team. Instead, they sent Elmore Combs. He arrived at Alma's cabin on a Thursday afternoon, and this time he did not come alone. He brought both of his remaining deputies, and he brought the rope. Alma was sitting on her porch when they arrived. She did not stand. She did not speak. She simply watched as Elmore dismounted from his horse and walked toward her with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had never been challenged. He told her that the games were over. He told her that the company had authorized him to remove her by force, if necessary. He told her that she had 1 hour to gather her belongings and leave, or she would be arrested for trespassing on company property. Alma looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked him a question that he did not expect. She asked him if he remembered what had happened to his predecessor. Elmore's expression changed. The sheriff before him, a man named Dalton Prewitt, had disappeared in 1919. The official story was that he had left the county to seek work elsewhere. But everyone in Harlan knew that Dalton had been investigating the death of a miner who had been found at the bottom of a shaft with his hands bound. Dalton had asked too many questions, and one morning he had simply vanished, along with his horse, his badge, and every document related to his investigation. No one had ever found him. No one had ever looked. Alma did not say anything more. She simply stood, walked into her cabin, and closed the door. Elmore stood in her yard. For nearly 10 minutes, his deputies shifting nervously behind him. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back to town. He did not speak for the rest of the day. That night, Elmore Combs made a decision that would determine the course of the next 3 weeks. He decided that Alma Skaggs was a problem that required a permanent solution. He did not consult the company. He did not consult his deputies. He simply began making preparations, gathering supplies, and planning an operation that he believed would end the matter once and for all. What he did not understand, and what he would not understand until it was far too late, was that Alma had been making preparations of her own. She had been making them for years. The people of Harlan County would later say that Elmore walked into a trap that had been set long before he was born. They would say that Alma's grandmother had taught her things that no woman should know, secrets passed down from the old country, techniques for survival, that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with patience. They would say that Alma had known from the moment she saw Elmore's smile that he would come for her, and she had been waiting. But none of them would say these things out loud. Not for decades, not until everyone involved was safely in the ground. Elmore returned to Alma's property on the night of March 17th, 1923. He came alone, which was his first mistake. He came at midnight, which was his second. And he came with the intention of frightening a woman who had long ago forgotten how to feel fear. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the hollow where Alma lived was darker than any place Elmore had ever known. He had brought a lantern, but he did not light it. He wanted to approach in silence, to catch her unaware, to demonstrate that he could reach her whenever he chose. He tied his horse to a tree at the edge of her property and began walking toward the cabin, his boots sinking into the soft earth with each step. He never reached the door. What happened next was pieced together from fragments, a torn piece of Elmore's coat found 3 weeks later, the testimony of a neighbor who heard sounds that night but refused to describe them, and a single page from Alma's diary that was discovered hidden in the walls of her cabin decades after her passing. The page read simply, "He came for me in the dark. He did not leave in the light." Elmore Combs was not seen again. His horse was found the following morning, still tied to the tree, its eyes wide with a terror that the veterinarian said he had never witnessed in 30 years of practice. The animal had to be put down. It would not eat, would not drink, and would not stop trembling. The deputies searched for Elmore for 3 days. They searched the hollow, the ridge, the mines, and every abandoned structure within 10 miles. They found nothing, no body, no badge, no weapon, no trace of the man who had controlled the county for 7 years. And then they stopped searching. They stopped because Alma Skaggs walked into town on the 4th day, went to the company store, purchased flour and salt and coffee, and walked out without anyone saying a word to her. They stopped because they understood, all of them, that something had changed. The company sent a letter to the county requesting information about their sheriff. The letter was never answered. A new sheriff was appointed 3 months later, a man from another county who knew nothing about Elmore Combs and asked no questions about his predecessor. The surveyors never returned to Alma's Ridge. The company quietly removed her property from their acquisition list and never mentioned it again. And the people of Harlan County learned a new rule, one that was never written down but was understood by everyone who lived there. You did not go near the Skaggs Hollow. You did not speak Alma's name after dark, and you did not, under any circumstances, ask what had happened to the sheriff. If you're still watching, I want you to do something. In the comments, write the most disturbing thing you have learned from this story so far. Not because I want to shock you, but because I want to know if you understand what kind of history we are uncovering together. The people who lived through these events never had the chance to speak. You do. The years that followed Elmore's disappearance were marked by a silence so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. The county continued to function. The mines continued to operate. Children were born, old people died, and the seasons turned with the same indifferent rhythm they always had. But something had changed in the way people carried themselves, in the way they looked at the mountains, in the way they lowered their voices when they passed the road that led to Alma's Hollow. Alma herself continued to live exactly as she had before. She tended her garden, preserved her vegetables, and occasionally walked into town for supplies. No one spoke to her beyond what was necessary. No one met her eyes. And no one, not once, asked her about the night of March 17th. The new sheriff, a man named Harold Benton, arrived in June of 1923. He was younger than Elmore, less experienced, and entirely unprepared for what he found. His first week in Harlan County taught him that his job was not to enforce the law, but to maintain a careful balance of ignorance. When he asked about his predecessor, he was met with blank stares and changed subjects. When he requested access to Elmore's files, he was told that they had been lost in a fire that no one could remember. And when he mentioned the name Alma Skaggs in conversation with one of his deputies, the man went pale and left the room without explanation. Harold was not a stupid man. He understood that something terrible had happened, and he understood that everyone around him had agreed to pretend that it had not. He also understood that his survival in this position depended on his willingness to accept this pretense. So he stopped asking questions. He filed his reports, collected his salary, and learned to look the other way when the company asked him to. But he could not stop thinking about Alma Skaggs. He began keeping a private journal, hidden in a lockbox beneath the floorboards of his office. In this journal, he recorded everything he could learn about the woman in the hollow, fragments of gossip, half-remembered stories, and the occasional drunken confession from miners who had known her family. He learned that her grandfather had come to the mountains from somewhere in Eastern Europe, a place no one could name, but everyone described as old and dark. He learned that her grandmother had been feared and respected in equal measure, a woman who could cure illnesses that doctors could not explain, and who had once predicted a mine collapse 3 days before it happened. He learned that Alma had inherited more than just land from these people. And he learned from an old woman who spoke to him on her deathbed that the hollow where Alma lived had a history that stretched back before the county was founded, before the first settlers arrived, before anyone had given the mountains a name. The old woman told him that the hollow was a place where things could be buried and never found. She told him that the ground there was different, that it did not behave the way ground was supposed to behave. She told him that her own grandmother had warned her never to dig in that soil, no matter what she lost, no matter what she needed to find. And then she died, and Harold was left with a journal full of fragments and a growing certainty that Elmore Combs was somewhere in that hollow, beneath that soil, in a grave that would never be discovered. He considered investigating. He considered riding out to Alma's property, demanding answers, asserting the authority that his badge was supposed to represent. But every time he thought about it, he remembered the look on his deputy's face, and he remembered the horse that had to be put down, and he remembered that Elmore Combs had been a man who made people afraid, and even he had not been afraid enough. Harold Benton served as sheriff of Harlan County for 11 years. He never visited Alma's Hollow. He never mentioned her name in an official document. And when he finally retired and moved to a town 200 miles away, he left his journal behind, hidden beneath the floorboards, for the next sheriff to find or ignore as he saw fit. The journal was not discovered until 1968, when the old sheriff's office was demolished to make way for a new municipal building. By then, Alma Skaggs had been dead for 15 years, and everyone who had known her personally was either gone or unwilling to speak. The journal was given to the County Historical Society, where it sat in a box for another 3 decades, before anyone thought to read it. The question that haunted Harold Benton, and that would later haunt everyone who read his journal, was not what had happened to Elmore Combs. The question was why no one had tried to stop it. Harlan County in 1923 had a population of nearly 12,000 people. It had churches, schools, a newspaper, and all the institutions of a functioning American community. It had men who considered themselves honorable, women who considered themselves righteous, and families who believed they were raising their children according to principles of decency and law. And yet, when a man disappeared under circumstances that everyone understood to be suspicious, not one of these people demanded an investigation. Not one of them contacted authorities outside the county. Not one of them spoke to the newspapers that occasionally sent reporters to cover the labor disputes in the mines. They simply accepted Elmore's absence, adjusted their behavior accordingly, and continued with their lives as if nothing had happened. Harold's journal contains his attempts to understand this collective silence. He interviewed dozens of people over the years, always carefully, always indirectly, and he recorded their responses with the precision of a man who knew he might be the only witness to a truth that would otherwise be lost. What he found was not conspiracy. It was not coordination. It was something far more disturbing. It was relief. The people of Harlan County had been afraid of Elmore Combs. They had been afraid of his midnight visits, his unspoken threats, his willingness to use his authority to protect the interests of men who saw them as expendable. They had watched him destroy families, silence dissent, and maintain a system of control that benefited no one except the company and its shareholders. And when he disappeared, they felt something they had not felt in years. They felt free. This freedom came with a price. They knew, all of them, that whatever had happened to Elmore was something terrible. They knew that Alma Skaggs was responsible, even if they could not prove it and did not want to try. And they knew that by accepting her act, by refusing to investigate or report or even acknowledge it, they had become complicit in something that violated every principle they claimed to believe in. But they accepted this complicity because the alternative was worse. The alternative was returning to the way things had been, to the fear and the helplessness and the knowledge that the law would never protect them from the men who held real power. Alma Skaggs had done something that none of them had the courage to do. She had fought back. And even if her methods were horrifying, even if her act was unforgivable by any standard of morality or law, she had proven something that the entire county needed to believe, that the people in power were not invincible, that there were limits to what they could do, and that some prices were too high to pay. This was why no one reported her. This was why the company quietly withdrew from her property. This was why the new sheriff never asked questions, and the old stories were never told to outsiders. It was not fear of Alma, although that fear was real and justified. It was fear of losing the only victory they had ever won against a system that had been crushing them for generations. Harold understood this, eventually. He wrote in his journal that he had come to Harlan County believing in law and order, believing that his badge represented something higher than the petty corruptions of local politics. He had left knowing that law and order were luxuries that only the powerful could afford, and that for everyone else, justice was something you took when you could and kept secret when you had to. He never forgave Alma for what she had done, but he never condemned her either. His final entry, written the night before he left the county forever, contained a single sentence that would later be quoted in every account of this story. She did what the law would not do, and the law did what it always does. It looked away. Alma Skaggs died in 1953, 30 years after the night that Elmore Combs disappeared. She died in her cabin, in the same bed where her mother had died, in the same hollow where her grandfather had built the first walls with his own hands. She was 71 years old, and she had spent the last 3 decades of her life in a solitude so complete that some people in the county had forgotten she existed. Her body was found by a neighbor who had not seen smoke from her chimney in 3 days. The neighbor, a man named Thomas Whitaker, was one of the few people who had maintained any contact with Alma over the years. He had been a child when Elmore disappeared, and he had grown up hearing the whispered stories about the woman in the hollow. But unlike most people in the county, Thomas had never been afraid of her. He had seen her as a survivor, a woman who had endured things that would have broken anyone else, and he had respected her for it. When Thomas entered Alma's cabin, he found her lying peacefully, her hands folded across her chest, her eyes closed. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of pain or fear. She had simply stopped living, as quietly and deliberately as she had done everything else. But Thomas found something else in the cabin that day, something that would change his understanding of everything he thought he knew. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in a wooden box that had clearly not been opened in years, he found a collection of documents. There were letters, dozens of them, written in a hand that Thomas did not recognize. There were newspaper clippings from counties across 3 states, each one describing the disappearance of a man in a position of authority. There were diagrams, carefully drawn, showing the layout of properties and the locations of structures that no longer existed. And there was a single photograph, yellowed with age, showing a young woman standing beside an older woman in front of a cabin that Thomas recognized as the one he was standing in. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that matched the letters, was a message: "For Alma, when you are ready. Remember what I taught you. Remember why." Thomas read the letters over the next several weeks. They had been written by Alma's grandmother, a woman who had died in 1896. When Alma was 14 years old, they described a tradition that had been passed down through generations, a set of practices designed to protect women who had no other protection, to give them power when the law refused to give them justice. The practices were not supernatural, they were not magical, they were simply the accumulated wisdom of women who had learned over centuries how to survive in a world that considered them property. The letters described techniques for identifying men who posed threats. They described methods for isolating those men, for drawing them into situations where they could be neutralized. They described ways of disposing of evidence that left no trace, ways of creating fear that spread through communities like disease, ways of ensuring that the women who used these techniques would never be suspected because the men around them could not imagine that a woman was capable of such things. and the letters described, in clinical detail, the fate of at least 7 men who had threatened Alma's grandmother or her family over the course of her lifetime. 7 men who had disappeared without explanation. 7 men whose bodies had never been found. 7 men who had been buried in the hollow, in graves that no one would ever discover, because the women who dug them knew secrets about that soil that no one else had ever learned. Thomas Whitaker read these letters, and then he did something that he would struggle to explain for the rest of his life. He burned them. He burned the letters, the clippings, the diagrams, and the photograph. He scattered the ashes in Alma's garden, where they mixed with the soil that had kept so many secrets for so long. And then he went to the county office and reported that Alma Skaggs had died of natural causes, alone, with no surviving family and no estate worth mentioning. He told no one what he had found. He told no one that the woman in the hollow had been part of something larger, something older, something that stretched back through generations and across continents. He told no one that the disappearance of Elmore Combs was not an isolated act of desperation, but the continuation of a tradition that had protected women like Alma for longer than anyone could remember. He kept the secret because he understood finally why secrets like this had to be kept. He understood that the world was not ready to know what women could do when they had no other choice. He understood that the law and the men who enforced it would never accept that their power had limits. And he understood that somewhere, in some other hollow, in some other county, in some other state, there was another woman learning the same lessons that Alma had learned, preparing for the day when she would have to use them. Thomas Whitaker lived until 1987. He never spoke about what he had found in Alma's cabin, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. But in the final year of his life, suffering from an illness that he knew would take him, he wrote a letter of his own. He addressed it to no one in particular. He sealed it in an envelope and placed it in a lockbox with instructions that it should be opened 50 years after his passing. The letter contained a single paragraph. "I found the truth about Alma Skaggs, and I destroyed it. I did this because some truths are too dangerous to survive. But I want someone to know, even if that someone is a stranger in a future I will never see, that she was not a monster. She was a woman who refused to be a victim, and in a world that gave her no other choice, she chose to be something that the world was not prepared to understand. I do not ask for forgiveness. I only ask that you remember her, and that you understand why some graves must never be opened." The lockbox was opened in 2037. The letter was read by a historian researching the social history of Appalachian women. The historian searched for any trace of Alma Skaggs, any record of her life or her family, any evidence that might confirm or deny the claims in Thomas Whitaker's letter. She found almost nothing. She found a name on a census record. She found a death certificate listing natural causes. She found the deed to a property that had been sold to the state and converted into protected forest land. And she found, in the archives of the Harlan County Historical Society, the journal of a sheriff named Harold Benton, who had written about a woman in a hollow who had done something terrible and gotten away with it. The historian published her findings in an academic journal that was read by fewer than 200 people. She noted that the story of Alma Skaggs was probably a combination of fact and folklore, that the details had been exaggerated over time, and that there was no conclusive evidence that Elmore Combs had been murdered rather than simply leaving the county. She concluded that the legend of the Hollow Witch was an example of how communities process trauma through narrative, creating stories that give meaning to events that would otherwise be senseless. She was wrong. The truth was buried in the hollow, beneath soil that had been keeping secrets for longer than anyone alive could remember. The truth was, in the letters that Thomas Whitaker had burned, in the traditions that Alma's grandmother had passed down, in the silence of a county that had chosen complicity over justice. And the truth was, in the eyes of a woman who had once stood on her porch, watching a man in a sheriff's uniform walk toward her with rope in his hands, knowing exactly what she was going to do and exactly how she was going to do it. Alma Skaggs was not a legend. She was not a monster. She was a woman who had learned that the only protection available to her was the protection she created for herself. And in a hollow where the ground did not behave the way ground was supposed to behave, she had exercised that protection with a precision and a patience that the men who threatened her could never have imagined. The sheriff was buried there. So were others. And the hollow keeps its secrets still beneath the trees that have grown over the graves, in the soil that has never been disturbed, in the silence that has lasted for 100 years and will last for 100 more. If you watched until here, it is because you could handle the truth. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly follows these stories. If this story disturbed you, if it made you think about the things that history chooses to forget, and the reasons why some truths are buried deeper than others, then you understand why I tell these stories. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the next time you pass a hollow in the mountains, the next time you see a cabin at the end of a long dirt road, the next time you hear a story about a woman who lived alone and kept to herself, some silences are not empty. Some graves are not accidents, and some women learned long ago that the only justice available to them was the justice they made with their own hands.